I've been dreading this episode for a long time, and by the end of this video, you'll know why. Hi, and welcome to a new episode that will hopefully allow you, non-Hebrew speakers, to read the text of the book of Genesis in the original. We are in a new day of the creation, and in this installment, we are covering not one but 3 verses for the first time in this series. Put differently, we'll do the whole second day of the creation in a single video. So let's go straight to the first verse. It's Genesis 1:6. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any English version that faithfully conveys the nuances of the original Hebrew, in my view at least. So I'm using the King James Version as a default. The verse sounds in Hebrew as follows. Vayomer Elohim, Yehi Rakia betoch hamayim, vihi mavdil ben mayim lamayim. My loyal viewers might be able to recognize a few words. In fact, the reason we can now progress more rapidly is that a lot of the vocabulary in these verses have previously appeared in the chapter with one notable exception. Actually, 2 exceptions in Genesis 1:6. You know, I'm trying to make each episode as standalone as possible. But with this specific video, if you happen to land here by chance, maybe it's the YouTube algorithm, I of course don't want you to go anywhere, but it might be a good idea in this particular case to jump to the first video about Genesis 1:1 using the playlist with all the videos I posted so far. And watch through the episodes until you come back to this one with much more knowledge, which will help you follow me better. It's not a must, just a recommendation. To go to the playlist, you can click on the link above. Beginning with the first word of the verse, it's Vayomer, which we got to know back in verse 3. It means, and he said. Again, we have here the verb placed up front, and the letter Vav serving as the conjunction and, but also as a converter from future to past. This was explained in previous episodes. The next word is Elohim, or God. Together, the first 2 words are Vayomer Elohim, which is a unit that appears again and again throughout this chapter and far beyond. Now we get to what God said. The first word is Yehi. You might recall that in verse 3, this exact word was used in the command part when creating the light. We noted there that Yehi is in the future tense, not the imperative. So from a grammatical point of view, God said that something will be, not ordered it to be. This blending of the future and the imperative is common in Hebrew, both biblical and modern. And also, as we've said in that episode, Yehi is a shorter version of the standard for will be in Hebrew, giving it a much more biblical flavor. As a consequence, my opinion is that it would be best translated literally as shall be. So something should come to existence after this command Yehi, and it is the thing referred to by the next word, Rakia. In the King James Version and others, Rakia is translated as firmament or expanse in some other versions, whatever those actually mean. Rakia is the key word in the whole paragraph, and the one I hinted to before. We are going to look into its meaning later on in the video. But first, before we come to any conclusion of what Rakia means, let's gather information about it as we go over the 3 verses. This may help us in the task of understanding what Rakia actually is. Next up, the word is betoch. This one is also new to us, and as we're going to see shortly, I believe that all English translations miss the mark here. Since this might somewhat change the visuals of the verse, I feel obligated to provide you with some proof for my claim. The most common meaning of betoch in the Hebrew Bible is among or between. This is a biblical use not shared by the modern language. We in Israel use bain from Genesis 1:4 and the verses we are covering today as the equivalent of among or between. Back to betoch, there is no short of examples of using it to mean among. But from context, it doesn't make sense that this thing, the rakia, was among the water. And therefore, I suggest that we skip those examples. There is another meaning of betoch, which is inside or within. This one is indeed shared with the modern language and is used extremely often. For example, haner betoch hadlat. The candle is inside the pumpkin. Betoch as inside or within is much less prevalent in the Bible, but it does exist. For example, the latter part of Psalms 49 in the Tanakh, which is verse 8 in the Old Testament. Almost all English versions of Genesis 1:6 translate betoch as in the midst of. Based on English dictionaries, this can mean both among and in the middle of. To me, as a native speaker of modern Hebrew, translating betoch as in the middle of seems to be a bit off. After going over dozens of verses in the Bible, I don't see any evidence to support that betoch refers specifically to the middle of things. It might, and I can't rule out the possibility that English translations carry over an ancient meaning that was captured by the Greek in antiquity and is not available to me. However, there are some examples where it is quite clear that in the middle of or in the midst of is not really supported. Like Micah 3:3. It doesn't make much sense that the prophet specifically referred to the meat as being right in the middle of the cauldron, surely not among the cauldron. The meat is probably just inside the cauldron. Or Genesis 18:4, where Abraham negotiated with God about whether the city of Sodom should be destroyed. To sum up, I believe that the best translation for betoch in Genesis 1:6 is inside or within and not in the midst of. In terms of visuals, I believe that the rakia, whatever it might be, was created inside or within the primeval water. Or in other words, the rakia was initially submerged in the sea. The next word is hamaim, the water, which we have encountered in verse 2. Reading the part of Genesis 1:6 we've covered so far, a literal translation would be, "And said God, shall be a rakia within the water." The second part of the verse starts with vihi. Without the nikud, or the Hebrew system of vowels, this word looks exactly the same as vayehi from verses 3 and 5. As you might recall, vayehi is a verb in the future, converted to be in the past. But based on context, it's quite obvious that the vav in vihi, which we're looking at now, is not a converter. Here it's not a description of something in the past, like in the case of vayehi, but a command uttered by God, which clearly refers to what is going to be created in the near future. So this is simply the future tense without converting to the past. The fact that vihi does not contain a converter is reflected by the nikud, which in turn affects how the word sounds. Vihi as opposed to vayehi, which means that in Hebrew, at least according to the official grammar, the letter vav as a conjunction has several pronunciations based on any added use it might have and the letter that follows it. Imagine the word and in English sounding ind, und, etc. in different situations. Based on our discussion about Genesis 1:3, the literal translation of vihi should be, in my opinion, and shall be, i.e. in the future tense, only here used as a command. The word after that is mavdil. It shares the same root as vayavdel in verse 4. The common English translation is to separate or to divide. By and large, this does correspond to the Hebrew, but with a small caveat. If mavdil was to separate or to divide, the Hebrew should have been lehavdil, like in verses 14 and 18, because this is how the infinitive is constructed in Hebrew. Sorry for the grammar, but the infinitive form of verbs in English starts with to, like to learn, to see, to sing. In Hebrew, the infinitive begins with the letter lamed, which is not the case in verse 6. And going back to the word in the present verse, if mavdil is not the infinitive as suggested by the translation, what is it? Well, based on how Hebrew grammar works, it can be several things. But in this case, it is almost certainly a noun, meaning a separator or a divider. It's a nuance for sure, but there is a slight semantic difference between to separate and to be a separator. I won't get further into this here because it might bore most of you. I will post a pinned comment below with some evidence for mavdil being a noun. And thus, the literal translation so far should probably be, and said God, shall be a rakia within the water, and shall be a separator. Which begs the question, a separator between what? This leads us to the next three words, and they should also be familiar to anyone who's been with me for some time. The first of the three is mime, which means water, and we've seen just minutes ago, and appears here twice. And the other word is bain, or between, that has already been discussed in verse 4. If you can recall, in that verse, we talked about the format bain uvein, or between and between in the literal English translation. Here, it's slightly different. Instead of the second bain, we have the prefix lamed, which we touched upon in verse 5. This prefix means to the, whereas virtually all translations use from. Of course, to and from are the opposite directions. So literally, this translates as between to the. But there is more to it. According to the nikud, or the diacritical signs that serve as Hebrew vowels, the sentence reads between water to the water. This is non-standard even in Hebrew. In Judaism, the nikud was sanctified as the original pronunciation and is the authoritative way of reading the Bible, despite being added only in the 8th century CE. The argument is that this pronunciation had been passed verbally through the generations and only put in writing later on when use of Hebrew by Jews was significantly declining and efforts were made to preserve how the text sounds. However, a lot of my viewers do not necessarily accept this because they are not Jews or are Jewish but not religious. Also note that the nikud is not really necessary for reading and comprehension. In modern Hebrew, we rarely use nikud. Other than religious, poetry, and children's books, all other texts, including websites, newspapers, novels, legal texts, or post-it notes, are without nikud. The sounds of words are memorized, much like in English, or inferred through context. So let's drop the nikud and see if we can gain anything from doing that. Okay, now I would normally read this as bein maim le maim, or literally between water to water. There's no the here at all, unlike in many English translations, or the nikud. Hence, the literal translation of the whole verse is, and said God, shall be a rakia within the water, and shall be a separator between water to water, or water to the water, based on the nikud. Let's read verse 6 again in Hebrew, this time with my suggested translation. Note that I decided to keep the word firmament, because I prefer to use an English word in the translation. The verse sounds with the nikud, Vayomer Elohim, Yehi Rakia betoch hamayim, Vihi mavdil bein maim lamayim. Zooming out and looking at the entire verse, there is something kind of puzzling. It seems that there are two types of water, and they are being separated by the Rakia. We have already concluded that there was water in the primeval sea, based on verse 2. But what's the deal with the other type of water? We'll get to that later as well. Now we move to verse 7. It reads as follows: Vayas Elohim et harakia, vayavdel ben hamayim asher mitachat larakia, uben hamayim asher me'al larakia. Vayehi chen. This verse is quite long, but as we go over it, we'll see that we may recognize a lot of the words. The first word of the verse is a new one, vayas. The translation is "and made," and it appears as such in virtually all English versions. So the translation is aligned with the Hebrew meaning, other than the fact that vayas is a gendered verb, referring to a single male subject, while made in English is gender neutral. Another very frequent meaning of vayas in the Bible is "and he did," often referring to people doing or not doing what God commanded. So since biblical times to this day, to do and to make are represented by a single Hebrew verb. Note that, once again, we have a converting vav, since without it, yas is in the future. Also note that yas without the vav is another case of a shorter, more biblical version of the verb to make in Hebrew, while the standard is ya'aseh. This is similar to the mechanism used in vayar, or "and he saw," in verse 4. After vayas, it is Elohim, God. The following word is et. This is the fourth out of 21 times this word appears in the chapter. It has no equivalent in English. Then we have harakia. It's the same mystery word from verse 6, only this time preceded by the letter hey, which denotes the definitive article the, so the Rakia. Thus, the verse so far literally translates as follows: and made God the Rakia. The second part of the verse starts with the word vayavdel. This is the exact same word as found in verse 4, where God separated between the light and the darkness. In that video, I discussed several possible translations and concluded that the best one is likely to be "and he separated." Vayavdel can also mean "and he divided" or "and he distinguished." Interestingly, the verb vayavdel can refer to both God separating between the water or the Rakia doing that. Vayavdel is in the singular, third person, masculine, and both God and the Rakia are just that in Hebrew, masculine, third person, and singular. I know, some of you might not agree with what I've just said, especially relating to God being singular. I would like to reiterate that this channel is not designed in any way to affirm or shake anyone's belief system, only give you the facts based on the text. The next word is bain. We've just talked about this one a moment ago. Bain means between. We also covered the word that follows, hamayim, or the water. After hamayim comes asher, and it means which or that. Fun fact, the word without the nikud spells exactly the same as the name of Jacob's eighth son, Asher. As I've said earlier, despite not having the vowels, it is easy to get the right meaning based on context. So we Hebrew speakers don't tend to mix up the word for which or that and the name of an Israelite tribe. Also note that Asher is tense neutral and can refer to the past, present, and future. Yet in KJV and other versions, Asher is translated as which were, which was, and the likes, i.e. in the past, suggesting that the water was above or below the Rakia. However, when reading the Hebrew, it never says that the water was above the Rakia, and this situation can very well be true right now, at this very moment. The act of separating was indeed in the past, but once that happened, the verse in Hebrew may describe the water being separated ever since. To avoid this spinning to any particular time frame, other translations decided to drop the which or that altogether, and asher in the original is only implied. Next is mitachat, which means under or below. And then we have once again the word Rakia. This is yet another place where this word appears, here with the prefix la, which denotes to the. As I've promised, we'll talk about its meaning later on. So the verse thus far can be literally translated as and separated between the water that under the Rakia. Now let's try something new. Instead of me telling you the meaning of the next few words, why don't you try to read them? There is only one word we're seeing for the first time, me'al, or above. Can you read and understand it now? I'll give you a few seconds, and you can also pause the video. If you weren't able to read this, don't worry. It's not easy at all when a language very different from your own is involved. Anyway, this part sounds in Hebrew, uvein hamayim asher me'al larakia, or in a literal translation, and between the water that above the rakia. Note that we have here the format bein, uvein, or between and between, just like in verse 4. The two last words of verse 7 are vayehi chen. As noted moments ago, vayehi is a word we encountered in verse 3 and verse 5, and can be translated as and was. The last word of the verse is a new one, chen, which is more often pronounced ken. In modern Hebrew, ken simply means yes. So if you're being asked whether you would like to have some coffee, it's possible to reply, ken, bevakasha, yes, please. But this is not the meaning of ken or chen in the Bible. In fact, there is not even a word for yes in the Tanakh or the Old Testament, as far as we know. Back then, when wanting to give a positive response, they just repeated the main word or words in the question. For example, in Genesis 29:6, where Jacob asked how Laban was faring, saying hashalom lo, which can be literally translated, is peace to him. The herdsman replied shalom, or peace, denoting yes. So if ken is not yes in the verse, what does it mean? Well, as the English translations suggest, it indeed means so or thus. Several good examples can be found in the book of Proverbs, like this one in chapter 10, verse 26. There are more than 500 other places where chen or ken appears, mostly meaning so. We have completed verse 7, which literally translates, and made God the Rakia, and separated between the water that under the Rakia and between the water that above the Rakia, and was so. Let's read the verse again, this time in Hebrew, accompanied by my suggested translation, which is quite similar to the literal translation. Vayas Elohim et harakia, vayavdel bein hamayim asher mitachat larakia, ubein hamayim asher me'al larakia, vayehi chen. Now we turn to the last verse we'll cover this time, Genesis 1:8. Here's the verse in Hebrew. If you look closely, you might recognize some of the words. In fact, all of them but one have occurred in previous verses. Can you tell where the new word is located? Well, it's right here at the very end. For this verse, I could find two English translations that I believe bring across the closest meanings. Those are American Standard Version and Revised Standard Version. Reading the verse in Hebrew, it sounds like this. Vayikra Elohim larakia shamayim, vayehi erev, vayehi boker yom sheni. Let's go over the words really quickly. The first is Vaikra, meaning and he called or named. We talked about this one in the last video about verse 5. The word that follows is Elohim, God. Right after comes Rakia. The word closing the first part of the verse is Shamaim, sky, which appeared in verse 1. So the first sentence of verse 8 translates literally as follows: and called God to the Rakia, sky. It follows from this part of the verse that the sky is actually the Rakia. We'll come back to that later on. Now we get to the closing part of Genesis 1:8. The first 5 words are a single unit that appeared in the previous video about verse 5 and repeats itself throughout the chapter at the end of each day of the creation. Vayehi erev, vayehi boker, yom, or in a literal translation, and was evening, and was morning, day, with the number of the day obviously changing each time. I do have things to say about those recurring 5 words, vayehi erev, vayehi boker, yom, but as this episode is already long, we'll talk about them some other time. As said a few moments ago, the only new word here is the last one, sheni, or second. Combined with the word that precedes it, we get yom sheni, or second day. It doesn't really translate as the second day, as suggested by most English versions, because then it would have been hayom hasheni, which is not how the verse is written. Also, we don't have in Hebrew an equivalent to the indefinite article a or n, and I feel that it should not be included in the translation too, since it can suggest that there were several second days, and this is one of them, which doesn't seem to be supported by the Hebrew or logic in general. Yom Sheni, or second day, is actually the Hebrew equivalent of Monday. In Judaism, the first day of the week is Sunday, Yom Rishon, or simply first day. In Israel, Sunday is a normal working day. And speaking of the word Rishon, or first, it so happens that I've mentioned it in 3 different videos, despite the fact that it does not appear even once in the whole chapter. So verse 8 is translated literally as, and call God to the Rakia, sky, and was evening, and was morning, second day. And reading the same verse in Hebrew with my suggested translation, Vaikra Elohim larakia shamayim, vayehi erev, vayehi boker, yom sheni. Now we get to the main part of this video, understanding what Rakia actually means. We've come across it here not less than 5 times. From what we've read thus far, it appears from the text that the Rakia was created inside the water and was designed to separate between 2 bodies of water. Then God created it so that the Rakia separated the water below it from the water above it. And finally, we're told that the Rakia is actually the sky. But to be able to reach any conclusion about the nature of the Rakia, we better look elsewhere in the Bible and see if other instances of this word can help us. Rakia appears in the Bible 15 times in only 4 of the books: Genesis, Ezekiel, Psalms, and Daniel. In Genesis, Psalms, and Daniel, Rakia is strongly linked or even synonymous with Shamayim, or sky. In Ezekiel chapter 1, however, in the opening scene of the book, there is a depiction of heavenly creatures, and they are said to have Rakia over their heads. What we are being told in verse 22 is that the Rakia looked like Hakerach Hanora, the awesome ice or frost, which is not something we can really understand today. That verse also tells us that the Rakia is natui, above the creature. This word natui is based on a root often used to describe spreading, extending, or stretching things. A related verb, nata, is used numerous times to describe people putting up tents, i.e. taking folded panels of fabric and spreading them over poles, and figuratively also for spreading the sky over the world. Isaiah 40:22 combines both these uses. Two other verses in Ezekiel talk about Even Sapir. Even is a stone, and Sapir is a gemstone whose name is often translated as sapphire, and together literally sapphire stone. We don't really know what precious stone or mineral this is, or whether it's linked in any way to what we call today sapphire. It's not even clear to me whether that gemstone refers to the Rakia or to the throne that was above it. Rakia is also mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 23 and 25, but without any further information that can help us in our investigation. What's clear is that in Ezekiel, Rakia is not the sky, but something else. What can it be then? Well, we simply don't know. What we can determine is that the basic meaning of Rakia is not sky, but something else that the sky is made of or looks similar to. Only in Genesis 1, it's on a much grander scale compared to the object mentioned in Ezekiel. Another way we can get more information about Rakia is to look at the root and find similar words. As explained in the episode about Genesis 1:1, almost every Hebrew word is based on a 3-letter root, and that root is used to create more words, most often than not with similar or somewhat similar meanings. So the root of Rakia is this. The letters are Reish, which is the equivalent of R, Kof, which is the equivalent of K or Q, and Ein, which has a vowel sound and originally was pronounced from back in the throat. When looking at instances of this root across the Bible, it appears that the meaning is to hit or to hammer. For example, again in Ezekiel, but this time in chapter 6, verse 11. By the way, based on this verse, we Hebrew speakers regularly use lirkoa baregel, which is basically the same as in the verse, to describe the action of humans or animals stomping the ground with their foot. Another source that can help us are the elaborate instructions for building the Mishkan, or Ohel Moed, the portable temple that was used while the people of Israel roamed through the Sinai desert and until King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. There are a lot of technical terms there, and one of them talks about the copper altar that was covered apparently by sheets of that reddish metal that was made by flattening censers. The word rikuei has the same root as rakia. There also might be a related meaning of to stretch or to spread, like in Psalms 136:6. All this together suggests that the rakia is probably a solid structure made of hammered or pressed metal, at least allegorically. It never says that the rakia is dome-shaped, as many scholars have determined over the ages, but it's logical to think that based on how the sky appears to us, especially during the night in places with low light pollution, previously all over the world, and today in areas like the Negev desert in Israel. As to the two types of water, from what I'm reading, and while this is not written explicitly anywhere in the Bible, the rakia, which seems to be created underwater, was then lifted up, carrying with it a massive amount of water, which is the water above the rakia, and that has been suspended by the rakia ever since. This explanation is supported by the fact that both the sky and the sea are blue, and also the striking similarity between the Hebrew words for shamayim, or sky, and maim, water. And there is also a term found in several places in the Bible, arubot hashamayim, or the windows of the heavens, which are basically openings in that rakia through which the rain falls to the ground, at least during the deluge, and apparently coming from that reservoir in the sky. Alternatively, the rakia can also be a sheet of cloth or another material that is spread across the sky, as suggested by Psalms 104:2. Okay, all this does not sit well with what we know about the atmosphere, outer space, and scientific knowledge in general. I personally came up with a theory that, at least for me, explains this. I was debating myself long and hard whether to share it with you, but eventually, in spite of it not being particularly theological, I decided not to do that, in keeping with my commitment to stick to the linguistics. You are more than welcome to share your thoughts in the comment section. Verses 9 and 10 will be in focus in my next installment. But before that, please share this video with people who might be interested but are rarely or never on YouTube, so the algorithm can't reach them. I also love reading your comments and do my best to reply to questions about linguistics. It also makes me very happy and humbled whenever one of you decides to become a member or a Patreon. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit all in the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.